Morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. As many of you know, FPRI's annual Templeton Lecture on Religion and World Affairs is a very special occasion for FPRI, not only because of the quality of these lectures and the wisdom dispensed, but because this annual lecture has become one of FPRI's enduring traditions. This was founded in 1996 with a gift from late John M. Templeton Jr., MD. And this will be our 25th annual Templeton Lecture. John Jack Templeton was president of the John Templeton Foundation and had a decades-long association with FPRI. He served as our vice chair of FPRI's Board of Trustees for many years. Jack Templeton, along with his beloved wife, Pina, provided critical support to FPRI for many, many years. And we're deeply grateful to them both and to the Templeton family and now to the Psalm 103 Foundation for their ongoing support to FPRI and its mission. Simply put, FPRI would not be the robust institution it is today without their very generous support. This year, we're really fortunate to have as our Templeton lecturer, Robert D. Kaplan, who is FPRI's Robert Strauss-Hupé Chair in Geopolitics. Today, he's going to explore how geopolitics, technology, climate change, urbanization, and alienation will drive religion and belief in the 21st century. Bob needs no introduction to many of you. He's the best-selling author of 19 books on foreign affairs and travel that have been translated into many languages. These books include The Good American, The Revenge of Geography, Asia's Cauldron, Monsoon, The Coming Anarchy, and Balkan Ghosts. For 3 decades, he also reported on foreign affairs for The Atlantic. He was a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and the U.S. Navy's Executive Panel. Foreign Policy magazine twice named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. Before we get started, I'd just like to do our reminder to put your questions in the Q&A box. Roughly halfway through this hour-long event, we will be taking your questions. I would also like to thank our members, supporters, and trustees for their generous support, as well as to the Psalm 103 Foundation and the Templeton family, whose generosity has enabled us to bring you what I'm certain will be a fascinating presentation today by Bob Kaplan. So without further ado, let me turn the reins over to Robert Kaplan.
Well, thank you, Raleigh. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's an honor to be here to give the Templeton Lecture. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to take you through, over the next half an hour or more, the main geopolitical issues in the world today, and then I will segue into their effect on religion and how religion will be a major element in the 21st century. But the first half of the lecture will be on geopolitics, so bear with me because I'll be getting to religion in the second part. And as I talk about the geopolitics of the world, always keep in mind that, you know, the degree of tension that it increases, the claustrophobia, the anxiousness, the nervousness of our world because of all these events, all of which will drive belief. To get started, let me say that historians, you know, they're somewhat artificial, but they serve to explain things. So think of COVID-19, of the pandemic, as an historical chapter break between two forms of globalization, Globalization 1.0 and Globalization 2.0, as I refer to it. Globalization 1.0, which we just thought of as globalization beginning and end, but in fact was just the first phase, started after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it was mainly a good news story. It was a time friendly to optimists. Remember, when the Berlin Wall fell, there was no practical internet, no iPhones, no email addresses or anything. Technology really drove globalization 1.0, and it was synonymous with the spread of democracy around the world, with the enlargement of middle classes in many developing world countries, in the creation of middle classes for the first time in other countries. It was mainly about free trade. It was about the defeat of autocracy. It was about the creation of a global elite, shall we say, people who are at the top end of their societies, who are multilingual, very well educated, and who essentially had more in common with each other than they had with their ethnic or national compatriots back home. And this new global elite at the top end of society, got together to try to fix problems in the world. That was Globalization 1.0, as I said, mainly a good news story. Globalization 2.0, which we will head into as COVID-19 and its variants start to recede. Globalization 2.0 is more of a mixed picture, partly a bad news story. It's about the re-rise of autocracies. It's about the spread of populism. It's about the pressures on the middle classes and the splitting up of middle classes into upper middle and lower middle. It's about trade barriers rather than free trade. And whereas Globalization 1.0 was essentially America's unipolar moment, where there were few major geopolitical fractures, Globalization 2.0 is all about geopolitical fractures between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia. Let me go into these geopolitical fractures for a moment. This split, the rivalry between the U.S. and China is here to stay for quite a number of years. And the reasons have to do with the military, cyber, ideology, and trade. And it's worth going into each of them for a minute or two to explain why they are now permanent features of this Globalization 2.0 landscape. First, the military. The United States and Chinese defense establishments look at the world in absolutely 180-degree opposite terms. For the Chinese defense establishment and military, the South and East China Seas are blue water extensions of China's continental landmass. They are adjacent seas to China. They are what a Chinese senior colonel once told me was essentially our Caribbean, that we're doing nothing in the South China Sea that you Americans did not do in the Caribbean Sea in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's ours, in other words. The U.S. military looks at things in a completely opposite way. For them, the United States is an Asian power, and Asia is America's home waters. It began with the opening of Japan to trade in 1853 with Commodore Matthew Perry. It continued with the U.S. invasion and occupation of the Philippines. It went on to the marine landings through the many islands in World War II in the Pacific Theater. Then there was the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, the fact that the only U.S. nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike group that is not based in the United States is based in Asia at Yokosuka in Japan. So these are two totally different ways to look at things. Then there's cyber. Cyber is a positive element in terms of financial markets. They've united global markets the world over, driven up asset prices, created vast wealth, new companies, etc. But in geopolitics, cyber is a negative. It's because the United States and China are already in a hot cyber war. The Chinese have hacked into many U.S. military defense establishments, into the U.S. Navy ship maintenance logs, into the Pentagon's personnel system, into the companies that produce the component parts for America's warships and fighter jets, and on and on. And the U.S. is beginning to react in kind. With cyber, the enemy is not 100 or 1,000 miles away. The enemy is one click away. And that's why cyber is a destabilizing element in the U.S.-China great power fracture. Then there's ideology. For a third of a century, China had what we'll call an enlightened, risk-averse, collegial, technocratic, benevolent authoritarian regime. And that regime was a regime that had friends in Congress, friends in the media, friends in the White House, no matter what party was in power. And American business loved China and made fortunes in China. That China does not exist anymore. Xi Jinping has created a China that is not risk averse, but risk taking. It's no longer collegial. It's one man rule. China's leaders no longer have mandatory retirement ages. Xi Jinping can rule until essentially his entire lifetime. It's a China that features vast repression of ethnic minorities. This is a China, and so what's happened? What's happened is China has no friends left in Washington, none in Congress, none in the media, none in the White House. Again, no matter which party is in power, ideology has added a real deterministic hard edge to the U.S.-China rivalry. Trade, you all know about that. Donald Trump's tariff policies against China have essentially been continued by President Biden. Biden's Asia team is just as hardline against China as Trump's was, because Biden's team, made up of Democrats who are moderate Democrats who are all Asia specialists, essentially has become more and more hardline against China as China has shifted from this benevolent authoritarian regime to a less authoritarian regime. So what we're looking for, hopefully, in the U.S.-China relationship is a kind of post-Cuban Missile Crisis situation, where the United States and China set up rules of the road in order to balance against each other, in order to, rules of the road, parameters like the US and the Soviet Union set up after the Cuban Missile Crisis, to make the Cold War a bit more manageable and a bit less risky. And that's where the US-China rivalry is headed. It cannot be solved. And both sides know it, but they can establish parameters and rules. Think of this: we've had wars in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria and other places, and they have not affected financial markets or our way of life at all. If there were ever a conflict, a military conflict between the United States and China in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, it could have a devastating effect on financial markets. So we're really talking about something serious that'll increase international tensions tremendously. How long will it last? Get ready for a long period of great power fractures until there is an internal reckoning of sorts in one of the three great powers, the United States, China, or Russia. Remember, the Cold War was an international event, but it ended by virtue of a development in domestic politics. The Soviet Union collapsed. And so what we're looking for is some sort of domestic crisis in Russia, China, or perhaps even the US of such a dramatic effect that it will change the trajectory of this emerging great power fractures. And, moving away from Asia, moving away from, China's attempt to capture U.S. allies from Japan to Australia to influence their foreign policies. We'll look at COVID-19 just for a moment. Crises, wars speed up history. As Lenin said, you can have decades go on and nothing happens. And then in a few days or weeks or months, everything happens. COVID-19 is sort of like a crisis of war. It will have the effect of speeding up history. In many countries that have been affected and even devastated by COVID-19, we're moving out of it, but the developing world is just, is in the thick of it. So what would normally take 5 years to develop in, say, Iran or Ethiopia or South Africa would now take just 2 or 3 years. And that's, there are many, many reasons for the current warfare in Ethiopia, for the vast riots in South Africa, for the massive demonstrations recently in Iran. But one of those reasons in each of those countries had to do with the economic effects of COVID-19. So we're entering a more tumultuous world. And that's where I'm heading into my theme and the effect on religion. Europe, let's go to Europe for a moment. Europe's the fight zone. It's becoming neutral territory. When the Cold War existed, Europe did no trade with China or Russia because those countries had no economies to speak of. Nowadays, you take a country like Germany, which is getting most of its energy increasingly from Russia, where China will be its largest trading partner and where the United States will defend it. That's a good deal if you can get it. Alliances won't be so simple anymore. European countries will maneuver between Russia for energy, China for trade, and the United States for defense. It's a very complex, tense world out there. As far as Russia is concerned, Russia seeks nothing less than to recover in some fashion, formal or mainly informal, the territories of the former Soviet Union. Remember that Russia is an insecure land power. We're covering half the longitudes of the earth with no natural borders or rivers or high mountains to protect it. And as a result, it's constantly aggressive. And Putin's goal is, and also realize that Russia has been invaded not just by Hitler and Napoleon, but by Swedes, Lithuanians, Teutonic Knights, and Poles and others. So what Putin is trying to do is undermine the Baltic states, undermine Ukraine, be active in the northern part of the Middle East in order to regain the Soviet Union and its shadow zones, and also have a soft zone of imperial-like influence in Central and Eastern Europe, which he will obtain by supplying Central and Eastern Europe with natural gas energy, by running intelligence operations, crime syndicates, and other things that you can't put your finger on it as a news story, but certainly exists. Russia and China both have weak institutions. America's political problems are out in the open because it's a democracy. Russia and China, as authoritarian states, their domestic problems are a bit more hidden. But of the two, keep in mind that Russia's institutions are much weaker than China. And were Vladimir Putin to become incapacitated in some form, we really don't know the future of Russia, whether it will recover itself or whether it will become a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia or what. Then there's the Middle East. Let's go to the Middle East for a moment. In the Middle East, a few things. The first is that China is not just active in East Asia and Europe, it's active in the Middle East. It's spending hundreds of billions of dollars to develop influence, great power influence in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, and in other places. I've recently been in Egypt and Ethiopia, where China's influence is profound. China is building new factory towns, a new capital for the Egyptians. They're building all these tall buildings in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And China's influence and aid does not come with moral strings attached. It doesn't lecture these governments on human rights. So that, this is how China spreads its influence and unites through roads, railways, pipelines, shipping lanes, its trading empire in the Far East with its trading empire in Europe through the Middle East. The Middle East itself what's happened is that as American power weakens, conservative Sunni Arab regimes form alliances with Israel for access to Israel's technological and cyber and digital capabilities in order to defend themselves against Iran. Regional powers are really asserting themselves. Now, what I've been describing has been a world that is claustrophobic, anxious, nervous, more and more closely knit because of technology, everything from cyber to email to passenger jets, etc., where one part of the world, a crisis in one part of the world can dramatically affect a crisis in another part of the world as never before. This is a vastly unstable world. It's an imperial world because countries like Turkey, Iran, Russia, China, India are drawing on their imperial traditions in terms of their foreign policies. It's a world going from 7.7 billion people at present to roughly 11 billion people at the end of the 21st century. So it will be more crowded. It will be a more crowded world. And so everything about this, crowdedness, tension, geopolitical tension, and other factors argues counterintuitively, I would say, for a century of religion. Religion will do well in the 21st century. I don't mean that completely as a good thing. It's sort of a value neutral proposition, but let me develop it a bit more. I believe the 21st century will be a century of deep belief. I was recently in Turkey, and it was the first time I was in Turkey for 20 years. And I noticed two things: more burqas, more niqabs, more facial covering of women, more scarves covering their hair, etc. It had become a vastly more devout society. At the same time, everyone had their face in their smartphones, which 20 years ago was not the case. More technology, more religion. That's not a contradiction in terms. And it's not a contradiction in terms because technology is, we all hear about how technology empowers people. It also alienates people. It also creates more stresses and tensions in their lives where they find belief. It's a very human thing. The more technology, the more alienation in a way. There is a big difference between virtual reality and reality itself. And virtual reality may be all fine and good, but it's not the real thing. And the real thing can only be had by the most basic human emotions: love, belief, in religion itself. It's the tactility. It's the organic process of real human interactions that will be under threat in a world of virtual reality, of cyber, of 3D, of all of these things. It's the difference between the Zoom, encountering me right now as I speak through Zoom, as you know, and the difference between that and meeting me in person. Zoom may be a miracle, but it's not the same thing. And it's in that space in between where people will be searching for faith and belief as the whole world becomes virtual in a way. Another factor, governability will lessen as surveillance increases. People will feel less connected to the people they vote for and elect. In terms of the, the elected government's actual daily minute by minute effect on their lives, even as surveillance increases. As the cliche goes, we have no secrets anymore. Our devices that we carry with us can locate us at any moment. Every time we do a credit card transaction, we go to a website, somebody knows where we are physically. The Chinese are using surveillance at a very deep level. They're literally trying to monitor the minute by minute emails, website searches of hundreds of millions of people using their smartphones. And don't be surprised if China has an upsurge in religious belief. Beyond Confucianism, which is an ethical system more than a religious system. Because as surveillance increases, personal vulnerability increases. The feeling of being alone, naked, stripped down, where belief will form part of an answer. We think we're headed into this brave new technological world where our moods and everything will be governed by drugs and by pharmaceuticals and by technology, but there will be something missing, and that's why I think counterintuitively, the 21st century will be a century for religion. Then there's climate change. Whether you think climate change has been overrated or exaggerated or what, it doesn't matter, because the fact is that, earthquakes, hurricanes, storms, greater temperatures, more different kinds of weather are now affecting hundreds of billions of people. We've always had massive superstorms in the Gulf Coast and in the Indonesian archipelago. But never before in human history have we had vast urban concentrations of billions of people living in these places. So the simple rise, absolute rise in the human population, even as the rate of population growth decreases, will tend to have a much greater effect on climate. Storms now will ruin the lives of hundreds of millions of people rather than a few million or a few thousand during ages in history when there were just less people on the earth. So people, in addition to being alienated and feeling vulnerable and isolated because of technology, now more people will have their property damaged in coming years, in coming decades, because of climate change. And that gets to urbanization. Urbanization leads in part to anonymity. You're anonymous in these massive new apartment blocks being built. Go to many parts of the world. I mean, in Hong Kong, elsewhere, in Egypt, in Alexandria, I saw miles and miles of new massive apartment blocks packed with people who in previous generations lived as peasants in the field, tilling the fields, and now are all cramped up in these new apartments. This is what I call bad quality urbanization. If you look at many of the Middle East terrorists over the past few decades, and you do biographies of them, studies have found that many of them, most of them, grew up in what's called shanty towns, badly urbanized settings that were not finely urban on one hand, nor rural on the other, but in slum villages, cities, on the outskirts of cities, where they move to from the countryside. So migration, the creation of bad quality urbanization will drive religion. It will drive extremism, various things. There was a great, not a great, but he had some good ideas, some bad ideas, but his good ideas, and I'm talking about the late American anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, who wrote that Islam is a religion that has made hundreds of millions of people happy. It is, and it has made poor people happy. Islam is a religion perfectly suited for the poor because it's stark, it's simple, it's a religion that's prepared to fight. And as the Middle East over the past 50 years has become more urbanized to where the Middle East is no longer a desert setting. I mean, Saudi Arabia, we think of deserts, but in fact, most Saudis live in cities now. And it's the same throughout the Middle East. And what has happened in this as people have moved from deserts to cities? Something very complex. In the countryside, religion was a non-ideological, natural form of worship, which was basically unthought of and unspoken. It was part of the traditional lifestyle of the village. But as people migrated into cities where they had to live among strangers whom they didn't know, Islam took on more of an abstract and ideological cast, so that what we call fundamentalism is synonymous with urbanization over the past 50 years in the Middle East. Religion has an advantage, specifically in Iran and other places. It has a monopoly on virtue. For a long time, myself and others thought that the Iranian Revolution would go the way of the Soviet Union. And that I said that Iran was in the Brezhnev phase of the Islamic Revolution, Leonid Brezhnev being the last ruler of the Soviet Union who ruled for many decades before the Soviet Union went through a few very weak leaders who governed for a year or two, and then it collapsed. But then I began thinking that communism, as total as it was not Islam. It was not religion. People were cynical about it. So that there's a real battle taking place in Iran. The Ayatollahs have the monopoly on virtue, which makes them difficult to topple. On the other hand, keep this in mind. The very politicization of religion signals an end of true devotion. In other words, once religion becomes politicized, becomes bureaucratized, becomes synonymous with the Ministry of Motor Vehicles and the Ministry of Agriculture, because it's a religious government or regime, religion loses some of its aura of legitimacy. So there is this tension going on in Iran. It has to do with religion. So showing once again how religion is such a factor. Either way, religion, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, will be instrumental to the political trajectory of the middle 20th century, which we are entering into it now. Meanwhile, here at home, let's look at the United States for a moment. Here at home, there seems to be a political division between secular urban elites and more religious masses that live in the countryside, in more rural states with vaster geographic territory, but small populations. If you look at the map between Democrats and Republicans, a geographical map, you see that the blue, the Democrats control the two coasts and have spots in the middle in cities like Chicago or Houston. and of course in university towns, whereas the vast middle from Central California to Western New York State is all red and Republican. You know, this has a lot to do with many factors. Religion is one of them. And this brings me to conclude with a philosopher, a medieval Arab philosopher, Ibn Khaldun, who wrote in the mid-13th century, or thereabouts. Ibn Khaldun had a theory of history. And his theory of history was that cities form, they become more sophisticated, culture becomes much more effete and much more intellectual and richer and wealthier, and wealth is created so that you have very wealthy, sophisticated, intellectual people living in the cities, until the cities become so overly kind of developed, you know, materially and in terms of thought, that they get overrun by less sophisticated but more aggressive people in the countryside, who then come into the cities, topple the cities, and start new dynasties, and then the cycle begins again. You know, the cycles of history always have to do with a more religious, more devout countryside, streaming little by little over the years and decades into the cities until they gradually overcome them and start a new cycle of history. So everything points to the fact that religion, rather than being a good thing in the 21st century or a bad thing in the 21st century, will be a very relevant thing in the 21st century. And that the fact that, you know, that we're in an age of technology like we've never seen before does not mean that somehow there will be less faith, there will be less devoutness, there will be less belief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. That was fascinating. We have a couple of questions, and I encourage our audience to ask some more. We have one question, comment question. An increasing major global force is global aging and subsequent continuing labor shortages. How will this impact the other trends you have outlined? And I'm gonna add my own twist to that, which is our economic prosperity has been predicated on continuing population growth. If in fact we successfully, you know, subdue or stifle population growth, what's the long-term economic impact of that? So put those two together on the aging population.
No, aging is a very big factor. Remember, we're seeing serious aging in the developed parts of the world. In Europe and the Far East and the United States and Canada, but also in Russia, you know, and also in China. In Africa and poorer parts of the world, even there is aging going on. The rate at which populations grow, even in the poorest places in Africa, is slowing down. But it's slowing down at a much slower rate than population growth is slowing down elsewhere. So that what all this means is that what all this means is that, let me take it one place at a time. The United States will probably be okay because, again, counterintuitively, we will keep letting in immigrants. You know, we may demand they all have college degrees or they have to fit certain jobs, but there will always be immigrant pressure that will be met halfway in the United States. So even as we move towards zero population growth, the U.S. population as a whole will grow because of increased immigration, and the debate is only about how much immigration there should be. There's not a serious debate about no immigration whatsoever. Europe is at zero population growth, even negative population growth. At the beginning of the 21st century, there was one African for every one European. By the end of the 21st century, there will be 7 Africans for every 1 European. Now, Africa is not only, Africa not only has failed states, it also has enlarging middle classes in many better run states. But the creation of middle classes throughout parts of Africa will only increase the need, will only increase pressures on immigration to Europe, because there will be a revolution of rising expectations. Because once people achieve middle-class lifestyle, they see all the problems with their own society, and if they have the option to move to a better society, they will. And also, people who are newly middle class and working class are not fatalistic like peasants. They look out for the main chance. So the very combination of still rising population growth, of growth of middle classes on one hand, of failed states on the other hand, will lead there to be constant pressure of African migration into Europe throughout the 21st century. And migration is more than just a word. It's, migrations always entail great personal hardships. And in a time of great personal hardships, again, people will take refuge in belief. In religion. Russia has a real problem because nobody wants to immigrate there, and its population is falling, essentially. Think of this, Raleigh. Bangladesh has more people than all of Russia, and it's 11 time zones, or it's 11, half the longitudes of the earth. So China is facing a real problem because it's getting it will remain poor without getting rich. It will stay. It will not become middle class before it will essentially. What I'm trying to say is, it will stay poor. It will stay poor without achieving a real middle class lifestyle, and again, because of slowing population.
Thank you. We have another question commenting that President Biden had 2 appointments last week with religious leaders. First, Pope Francis in the Vatican, as well as ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in DC. Can you comment on the meeting with Bartholomew in the context of U.S.-Russian relationships? Do you consider the Russian Orthodox Church as one of the Kremlin's expansion tools, and can the Greek Church be used for its deterrence?
Yes. What I meant to say before on China was China will get China will grow old before it gets rich. Normally, it's the other way around. By the time societies become elderly, they're already rich. China faces the problem of that not happening. Back to Bartholomew and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Keep in mind that the Orthodox Church is not like the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a pope who is a supreme leader of a sort for all the world's Catholics, whereas Orthodox churches are autocephalous. They are national churches. There's a national Russian Russian Orthodox Church, a Greek Orthodox Church, an Ethiopian Miaphysite Orthodox Church, a Bulgarian Orthodox Church. So Orthodox churches tend to be nationalistic. Whereas the Catholic world is more internationalistic because of the very design of the church, and it shows again the power of religion, that Russia is devout in many ways, because communism did not deliver. Communism replaced orthodoxy as a belief system, and didn't develop a moral framework or a lifestyle with any degree of human dignity. And because of that, the Orthodox Church, still has tremendous prestige in Russia. And the Orthodox world has to be reckoned with. It includes much of the Balkans, Greece, and all of, and this, and all of Russia. This is a big chunk of the world where belief is very deep, and orthodoxy also encourages nationalism. As for the actual context of the discussion between President Biden and Bartholomew, I'm sorry to say I did not cover that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. How does the GOP trend toward fundamentalist Christianity with violence and diminishment of rights predicated on religious ideology echo Middle Eastern religious trends?
First of all, that's only one trend in the Republican Party. The Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, is split in two halves. The Republicans are this trend that the questioner mentioned, and also traditional Republicans. With the Democrats, it's the progressives and the moderates, as we've seen in Congress in recent days. It's not like the Middle East, because in the Middle East you have weak state systems, essentially, and because you have weaker state systems, politics is both very autocratic and also very religious. The Middle East doesn't have moderates in the way we look at it. The Middle East is, the West, including the United States, has not known the degree of politicized religion since it was called Christendom in medieval Europe. It's different. It's a different factor. But clearly, we could look at what is the root of Islam, of deeply felt Christian belief, among Republicans especially. The root is a number of causes, which also drives populist politics, which is that the economic stagnation, the fact that China's entry into the World Trade Organization almost 20 years ago, diverted well-paying factory jobs from being created in the United States. And so, there's a feeling that things have not gotten better and elites have prospered, that the American middle class, rather than being a robust, solid state middle class, has split up into an upper middle class drifting into the global elite, and a lower middle, which is 1 or 2 or 3 steps away from poverty. And that vulnerability has driven religion, I think, in the areas where the questioner, is referring to.
We have a comment and a question from Walter McDougall. He says, another fascinating and amazingly pithy synthesis, Bob. Thanks very much. What trends do you project for global Christianity, especially in Africa and Latin America? Will third world Christians be more liturgical or evangelical, and what difference will that make?
Well, that's a great question. I can tell you, I was recently in Ethiopia, as you know, and you could talk about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It's beautiful, it's exotic. It was the foundation stone of the whole Horn of Africa region, one of them. But in fact, the real story in Ethiopia, beyond the headlines of the war going on, is the spread of Protestant evangelicism throughout Ethiopia. It's spreading like wildfire. And it's not only spreading in Ethiopia, it's spreading in many other places too in the developing world. It's been spreading in Guatemala since the 1970s, throughout Central America. Why is this? It's because the traditional churches, whether Orthodox in Ethiopia or Catholic in Central America, were not delivering the goods. People remain poor, and what evangelicalism has to offer is, it basically has a message. And the message is work hard, be self-disciplined, get up early in the morning, and your life will improve. It offers a pathway to material improvement, and also self-discipline, tremendous self-discipline. that the more traditional churches were not offering. So, and I said the Horn of Africa, Central America, also in the Balkans. The Balkans was mainly Eastern Orthodox. Evangelicism has been spreading in Romania since the Berlin Wall fell. And the same in other parts of the Balkans. So that even Protestant Western evangelicism has, it turns out, has been a real export item of the West into the poorer and troubled societies of the world that has not really been captured by the media thus far.
We also have a question from British Ambassador Hookie Walker, who asked, will resort to religion be more significant than resort to nationalism and ethnicity?
That's a great question. And of course, it gets complicated because in many places, religion and nationalism and ethnicity combine. There's very few contradictions between them, but in many more places, there are contradictions between them. As we saw in Iraq, there was always a sense of Iraqi nationalism, of pride in Iraq, going back to the days when the British ruled in the mid-20th century and the early mid-20th century, when they were sort of quasi-colonial powers. But there's also a sense of deep belief in being Sunni and Shia, which is buttressed by the geographical separation of Sunnis in the center, Shiites in the south of the country. And then there's the ethnic splits between the Kurds in the north and the Arabs in the south, who are both Sunni and Shia. And Iraq is just one country. It gets very complicated as you go from place to place. I would say that the degree to which nationalism, ethnicity, and religion can advance as identity symbols, as belief systems, will be partly based on the degree to which each of those things can take advantage of social media to project their value system. Because again, wherever you go in the world, wherever I've been in the past few months to Turkey, Egypt, Ethiopia, all those places, there's social media, everyone's got their face in smartphones. Everyone's using social media. So do not think that social media is just for a well-developed world or for the West. No, it's not. It's happening throughout the world, and it's dividing people as well as it's uniting them. And so it's a very, very complicated question. I can't say which it'll go, but nationalism, ethnicity, and religion will be potent identity symbols to the degree to which they can attach themselves to social media and other media in the 21st century at a time of otherwise there's going to be a lot of alienation.
Thank you. We have another question from an Ambassador Adrian Bezora. You seem to imply that religion remains a very important factor in the U.S. and other highly developed countries, even though their urban elites are largely secular and thus non-religious. How do you square this with the extreme decline of church attendance in these countries? And thus, what is your definition of religion in places traditional religious practice is declining?
What I've seen is that the organized churches, with their beautiful buildings and beautiful cathedrals, have to struggle. They can't rest on their laurels. They have to offer a message of improving people's material and psychological lives through their message, or else they will be overtaken. There's an old saying that once a company builds its own building, it builds its own building and has a headquarters with beautiful signs and offices, it's no longer as dynamic as it was when it was just a startup. And in a sense, you can find real deep belief in these one-story shack-like churches. If you drive across the United States, you see a lot of very humble, one-story sort of ranch house looking buildings that are in fact churches, where belief is very, very deep and and even fundamentalist, etc. And then you go to these massive, beautiful cathedrals, and there's less, and it is done as a ritual, as a social obligation, more than absolute deep belief. And I say this as someone who's driven across the United States several times and have visited these places, that religion will change. Religion will always be a factor, a deep factor, but it itself is going to change, and it's going to be affected by technology.
We also have a question, a little off the subject of religion, noting COVID-19 has opened the bioterror dimension. How does this play in the geopolitical competition?
Yeah, this is a very important topic, because still we don't know for sure how COVID-19 started in the first place. At first, people said the idea that it was concocted in a Chinese lab was nonsense. Now it looks a bit less like nonsense. It may even be a possibility. It may have been a lab mistake or something like that. But when we talk, originally, whenever we talked about weapons of mass destruction, we did not only mean nuclear weapons. And we did not only mean chemical weapons. We meant the spread of biological terror and disease. The spread of biological terror and disease is itself a weapon of mass destruction. And, and it will be a very potent weapon going into the future. Because we've seen what a relative, COVID-19 doesn't kill everybody. It kills only a very, very small percentage of the people who contract it. So in the range of what's possible in diseases, it's actually somewhat mild. Again, I want to say this in relative terms. It's mild in terms of what's possible, of what could be done.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Multinational corporations are at an intersection between the West, U.S. Europe, and the East, China. What is China's long game to position itself to become less dependent upon Western-based multinationals such as Boeing, Apple, GE, etc.?
Well, so far its long game has been what we call stealing, what they call acquiring technology. They're still not as innovative as the West is. So they, and it's very straightforward sometimes. They say you can locate a production plant in our country. That's fine, but you also have to, share with us the technology that you use. And so China's long game is acquiring Western technology up until the point where they don't need to do it anymore, where their own research and development and innovation can do it on their own without so-called acquiring, in quotes, stealing technology. I think that's its long game, essentially, to keep using the West until they don't need the West as much anymore.
Interesting. We have a question, and this probably will have to be our last. Which country can play the religious card best for geopolitical advantage? Russia is trying to do so. China is adept at neutralizing it despite its policies at home.
Well, I would say so far, at least, over the last generation, the country that's used religion for geopolitics in the most prominent way has been Iran. It's reached out, to the Shia world and to the Sunni world through its pro-Palestinian positions. And what Iran has done, it has used the traditions of ancient Persian empires, from the Mediterranean to the Central Asia and down to the Arabian Gulf, to spread its its influence, and particularly through the use of creating proxy armies. And religion has been a background noise to all of this. Russia, not so much. Religion is not, the Russians cannot use religion really because Orthodoxy, as I said, is a national religion. The Romanians, who are also Eastern Orthodox, the Romanian Orthodox Church, see the Russians as a rival and a threat completely. It's hard for an Orthodox country to be imperial in that sense, in that narrow sense. I think China has more to fear from religion than its use. It's trying to propagate the Confucianism, which I said is an ethical system that reveres order and respect for the elderly and many, many other features. But it's but real religion in China, like the spread of evangelicism or something like that, could be a problem for the Communist Party there.
Thank you, Bob. We are officially out of time, and what a marvelous discussion this has been. Thank you so much. Thank you to those of you who tuned in, and to our supporters. Of course, thank you. We cannot do what we do without you. Bob, thanks again, and all the best to our listeners. Please, this is being recorded, so you can watch it again on YouTube, and send it to your friends as well. Take care.
Thank you, Raleigh. Bye.
Bye.